Trust is a foundation upon which we build our most sacred institutions. It forms the invisible threads that bind communities together, creating networks of safety and belonging. We entrust our children to teachers, our health to doctors, and our security to those who wear the badge. But what happens when those we entrust with our safety become the very ones who cause us harm? In this story, a mentorship meant to guide a young girl toward a future in law enforcement instead leads to years of alleged exploitation and ultimately, prosecutors believe, murder. Set against the backdrop of a small Massachusetts police department, this disturbing tale unfolds as a young woman's dream of belonging to the world of law enforcement turns into a nightmare of control, abuse, and betrayal. The quiet streets of Stoughton, Massachusetts, a town where many residents know each other by name, would become the setting for a relationship that violated the most fundamental principles of trust and protection. This is the story of Matthew Farwell and Sandra Birchmore, two lives forever linked by a relationship that began in a police youth program and ended in tragedy. Our story centers around two individuals, Sandra Birchmore, a young woman with aspirations of joining law enforcement, and Matthew Farwell, the police officer who mentored her two lives intertwined by a program designed to inspire and guide youth. Sandra was described by those who knew her as quiet but determined. Growing up without strong family connections, she sought belonging and purpose. The structure and camaraderie of law enforcement appealed to her from a young age. Friends would later recall how she spoke about becoming a police officer with genuine excitement, her eyes lighting up at the prospect of one day wearing the uniform herself. Matthew Farwell represented everything Sandra admired. A respected officer in the Stoughton Police Department, he projected confidence and authority. As an instructor in the department's Explorers program, he was positioned as a role model, someone whose guidance could shape the futures of impressionable young people like Sandra. But beneath the surface of this mentorship lies a hidden truth. Prosecutors allege that Farwell used his position of authority to groom and exploit Sandra from the time she was a young teenager until her death at age 23. Pregnant with what she believed was his child. As we delve into this case, we'll explore how a relationship that began in a police explorers program allegedly evolved into years of control and manipulation, ultimately ending in what federal investigators now call a staged suicide. The story that emerges challenges our understanding of how predators operate within respected institutions, sometimes hiding in plain sight behind badges and uniforms. Every story has its beginning, a place where paths cross, trust is established, and lives become entangled. This story begins in 2010 in the town of Stoughton, Massachusetts, where a 12-year-old Sandra Birchmore joined the Stoughton Police Explorers Academy, a program designed to introduce young people to careers in law enforcement. The academy promised structure, purpose, and a sense of belonging to the young participants. For many, it represented a first step toward a noble career of public service. It was there that she first encountered Matthew Farwell, then 24, who served as an instructor in the program. With his crisp uniform and confident demeanor, Farwell cut an impressive figure to the young academy participants. For Sandra, who had few adult role models in her life, his attention must have felt special, validating. From the outside, their relationship appeared to be that of mentor and student, a police officer guiding a young person interested in following in his footsteps. For Sandra, who reportedly had few close family ties, the connection to the police department and to Farwell seemed like a lifeline, a chance to belong to something meaningful. The Explorers program offered Sandra structure and purpose, She attended meetings faithfully, absorbing the lessons on law enforcement procedure, ethics, and community service. Fellow explorers remember her quiet determination, how she would practice radio codes at home and study criminal justice whenever she had free time. For Sandra, the program wasn't just an after-school activity, it was the foundation for her future. But prosecutors now allege that what began as a mentorship soon evolved into something far more sinister. According to federal indictments, Farwell allegedly began having sexual contact with Birchmore when she was still legally a child, before she had turned 16 years old, an age at which she could not legally consent. While Farwell would later claim their relationship became sexual only in 2020, text messages cited in court documents suggest otherwise, painting a picture of a relationship spanning many years, beginning when Birchmore was still legally a minor. These messages, recovered during the federal investigation, would eventually help prosecutors piece together a timeline that contradicted Farwell's version of events. In one disturbing exchange from when Sandra was allegedly 15, prosecutors claim Farwell messaged her, "Remember, this stays between us. You're special, but no one would understand." The secretive nature of their communications established a pattern of isolation that would continue throughout their relationship. As the years passed, their connection only grew stronger, but not in the way a healthy mentorship should develop. Prosecutors describe a troubling pattern of control and exploitation that spanned nearly a decade. Court records allege that Farwell maintained significant control over Birchmore throughout their relationship. By the time Sandra entered high school, the alleged relationship had already crossed boundaries that no professional mentorship should ever approach. Former classmates recall Sandra becoming increasingly withdrawn, missing social events and declining invitations with vague excuses about other commitments. What these friends didn't know was that, according to court documents, Sandra was allegedly being isolated through a calculated pattern of control. He allegedly tracked her phone location, questioned her when she turned it off, and reportedly punished perceived misbehavior with acts of sexual violence. Text messages recovered during the investigation appear to show a disturbing power dynamic, with Birchmore at one point texting Farwell, "I was kinda scared to say no in the beginning, not knowing how you'd take it." The relationship followed classic patterns of exploitation, isolation, control, and emotional manipulation. Sandra's world increasingly revolved around Farwell. Court documents suggest he discouraged her from pursuing close friendships, monitored her social media activity, and created an environment where his approval became essential to her sense of self-worth. During her high school years, Sandra's academic performance suffered. Teachers noted her distraction, her occasional exhaustion in class. When concerned adults would reach out, Sandra would dismiss their worries with practiced explanations. What these educators couldn't see was the alleged psychological burden she carried, the weight of a secret relationship with a man more than a decade her senior, a man sworn to protect the community. Sandra grew from a child to a young woman under this alleged influence, her formative teenage years and early adulthood shaped by what prosecutors describe as a deeply unequal relationship with a man in a position of authority, a man sworn to protect and serve. As she reached adulthood, the nature of the control allegedly shifted. The relationship maintained its secrecy, but Farwell reportedly allowed Sandra more apparent freedom while maintaining psychological dominance. Text messages reveal patterns where Sandra would seek permission for basic decisions, apologize profusely for perceived slights, and express fear about disappointing him. "I'm sorry I didn't answer right away. reads one message prosecutors highlighted. "I was in class and couldn't check my phone. Please don't be mad." This pattern of seeking approval and fearing disappointment appears repeatedly in their communications, revealing a profound power imbalance. By this point, Sandra had graduated high school and was taking criminal justice courses at a local community college. On the surface, she was working toward her dream of a career in law enforcement. But beneath this appearance of progress, court documents suggest she remained trapped in a relationship that consumed much of her emotional energy and dictated many of her choices. The shadow of Farwell's influence extended into every corner of her life. According to statements from classmates, Sandra would sometimes leave class abruptly after receiving texts, returning with a visibly changed demeanor. Her career aspirations, once broad and optimistic, allegedly narrowed to focus on possibilities that would keep her close to Stoughton and to Farwell. Throughout these years, Sandra maintained the outward appearance of someone pursuing her dreams. She completed her studies, worked part-time jobs, and moved into her own apartment in nearby Canton. To casual acquaintances, she seemed to be finding her way into adulthood. But prosecutors allege that beneath this facade of normalcy, the exploitative relationship continued, with Farwell maintaining his psychological hold through a combination of affection, intimidation, and the power of long-established patterns. As the months and years passed, the web of secrecy grew increasingly complex. Sandra allegedly learned to compartmentalize, to present one face to the world while hiding the reality of her relationship with Farwell. This double life, living as both an independent young woman and as someone allegedly controlled by a manipulative partner, must have created immense psychological strain. Yet, through it all, Sandra maintained her connection to the world of law enforcement. The dream that had led her to the Explorers program as a 12-year-old still burned, albeit dimmed by the complex reality of her life. She continued to speak about eventually becoming an officer, about wanting to help others and serve her community. The tragic irony that her life had become entangled with someone who prosecutors allege had violated the very principles of protection and service that drew her to the profession would only become clear in the aftermath of her death. As 2020 approached, Sandra's life seemed poised for change. At 23, she had her own apartment, was continuing her education, and maintained a small circle of friends who knew little about her connection to Farwell. But the dynamics of their relationship were about to shift dramatically, setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to tragedy. By 2020, Sandra Birchmore was 23 years old. She had spent nearly half her life connected to the Stoughton Police Explorers program and to Matthew Farwell. And in late 2020, everything changed when Sandra discovered she was pregnant. The pregnancy test showed positive in November 2020. According to friends who spoke with investigators, Sandra's reaction was complex, a mixture of fear and something resembling hope. For someone who had grown up with few family connections, the prospect of becoming a mother represented a profound change. It meant having someone who would be bound to her by the deepest biological ties, someone who would need her, depend on her, love her unconditionally. According to court documents, she informed Farwell that he was the father of her unborn child. Court records suggest a disturbing arrangement between the two. Farwell had allegedly agreed to impregnate Birchmore as part of a deal for her to remain silent about their long-standing relationship, a relationship that began when she was legally too young to consent. The pregnancy announcement allegedly triggered a shift in Farwell's behavior. Text messages from this period show increasingly erratic communications, alternating between expressions of support and thinly veiled threats. "We need to be careful about how we handle this," one message read. "People wouldn't understand our history." But the pregnancy introduced a new complication, a tangible connection that could not easily be denied or hidden. For a police officer with a career and reputation at stake, prosecutors suggest this development represented a dangerous liability, evidence of a relationship that had begun when Birchmore was underage. As December progressed, Sandra began making tentative plans for motherhood. She researched prenatal care, looked into support programs for single mothers, and even started a private online registry for baby items. According to a close friend who later spoke with investigators, Sandra seemed to be finding a new sense of purpose in her pregnancy, despite the complications it presented to her relationship with Farwell. Meanwhile, according to prosecutors, Farwell was growing increasingly concerned about exposure. The pregnancy represented physical evidence of their relationship, a relationship that, if revealed to have begun when Sandra was underage, could destroy his career and potentially lead to criminal charges. Text messages show he began encouraging Sandra to consider terminating the pregnancy, suggesting they start fresh afterward. Sandra, however, had apparently made her decision. Friends reported that she was committed to keeping the baby, though she remained vague about the father's identity when speaking to most people in her life. Only to her closest confidants did she hint at the true nature of her situation, and even then she carefully guarded the details. The situation grew increasingly tense as January 2021 approached. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events leading to tragedy. On January 20th, 2021, a friend of Birchmore's contacted the Stoughton Police Department to report the relationship between Birchmore and Farwell. In what prosecutors describe as a critical breach of protocol, a department employee allegedly informed Farwell about this call, alerting him that their relationship had been exposed to his colleagues. This call, made out of concern for Sandra's welfare, would have profound consequences. According to court documents, Farwell immediately reached out to Sandra, demanding to know who knew about their relationship and what exactly had been said. Phone records show multiple calls between them in the hours following the report, calls that prosecutors characterize as increasingly urgent and confrontational. The clock was now ticking. Someone outside their closely guarded secret knew about the relationship, and that information had reached the very police department where Farwell worked. Just 12 days after this report was made, Sandra Birchmore would be found dead in her apartment. These 12 days were marked by increasing isolation for Sandra. According to her phone records, she canceled plans with friends, called in sick to work, and spent long periods at home alone. The few friends who did speak with her during this time later reported that she seemed anxious, checking her phone frequently and ending calls abruptly when certain topics arose. Security camera footage from her apartment building showed Farwell visiting multiple times during this period, sometimes staying for hours, other times leaving after just minutes. On January 28th, barely a week before her death, surveillance video captured Sandra and Farwell in what appeared to be a heated discussion in the building's parking lot, a conversation that ended with Sandra wiping tears from her face as she returned to her apartment alone. As January turned to February, the pressure was building. Sandra's pregnancy was advancing, the report to the police department hung like a sword over their relationship, and Farwell, prosecutors allege, was growing increasingly desperate to contain a situation that threatened to spiral beyond his control. On February 1st, 2021, Sandra made her last social media post, a cryptic message that read simply, "Some choices change everything." Hours later, security cameras would capture Matthew Farwell entering her apartment building, carrying what appeared to be a plastic bag. What happened inside that apartment would remain unknown until investigators began piecing together the final moments of Sandra Birchmore's life. In early February 2021, the body of 23-year-old Sandra Birchmore was discovered in her Canton apartment. The call came in at 11:42 a.m. on February 4th, when the building manager, conducting a wellness check after Sandra missed a scheduled maintenance appointment, used his master key to enter the unit. What he found inside would haunt him for months to come. Sandra was found hanging from the handle of her bedroom closet door. Her body was cold to the touch. She had been dead for some time. The scene bore all the hallmarks of suicide. A chair lay overturned nearby, as if kicked away. There was no sign of forced entry, no obvious struggle. A handwritten note lay on the bedside table, expressing regrets and vague apologies. The medical examiner, seeing what appeared to be a suicide, initially ruled her death as such, a tragic end that, had the investigation stopped there, might have closed the book on Sandra's story forever. The preliminary report noted ligature marks consistent with hanging, no defensive wounds, and no obvious signs of struggle. The case appeared straightforward. A young woman, perhaps overwhelmed by her circumstances, had taken her own life. But there were questions that lingered, details that didn't quite align. An audit would later confirm that Canton police had followed all proper procedures in their initial investigation, yet something still felt unresolved about the young woman's death. For one, friends who spoke with investigators expressed disbelief that Sandra would take her own life, particularly while pregnant. One close friend told police that just days before her death, Sandra had been making plans for a baby shower. Another noted that Sandra had scheduled a prenatal appointment for the following week. These actions seemed inconsistent with someone planning to end their life. Then there was the matter of the note. While it appeared to be in Sandra's handwriting, those who knew her best found the phrasing strange, uncharacteristic. The vague apologies and generalized regrets lacked the specificity one might expect in a final communication. And notably absent was any mention of her pregnancy, a circumstance that had become central to her life in recent months. Most troubling was the timing, just days after the report to the Stoughton Police Department about her relationship with Farwell. This coincidence raised red flags for several investigators, though initially there wasn't enough evidence to pursue alternative theories about her death. For months, Sandra's case remained classified as a suicide. Her funeral was small, attended by a handful of friends and former classmates from the Explorers program. Matthew Farwell did not attend. In fact, according to court documents, he took personal leave from the department, citing stress and personal matters. But beneath the surface, questions continued to simmer. Sandra's former mentor from the community college began collecting information, troubled by the circumstances of her death. A distant cousin who had reconnected with Sandra shortly before her death pressed police for more thorough investigation. And within the law enforcement community itself, whispers began to circulate about the nature of Farwell's relationship with the young woman who had once been his student in the Explorers program. It would take years before federal investigators would build a case alleging what really happened in Sandra's apartment that night. According to prosecutors, Matthew Farwell visited Birchmore under the pretense of bringing her ginger ale, but his actual intent was far more sinister. They allege he killed her and carefully staged the scene to appear as a suicide. As acting U.S. Attorney Joshua Levy would later state at a press conference, "We allege that Sandra Birchmore survived years of grooming, statutory rape, and then sexual violence, all at the hands of Matthew Farwell." He added that when Farwell could no longer control Birchmore, he silenced her permanently. The evidence that would eventually lead to Farwell's arrest included surveillance video and digital records that prosecutors say tell a damning story. Surveillance footage reportedly shows Farwell entering Birchmore's apartment at 9:14 p.m. on February 1, 2021, and leaving just 3 minutes after the last recorded movement on her phone, timing that investigators found highly suspicious. The video footage revealed something else that investigators found significant: Farwell's demeanor. As he entered the building, he appeared nervous, glancing repeatedly over his shoulder. When he left approximately 47 minutes later, building cameras captured him wiping his hands repeatedly on his pants, his movements quick and agitated. These were not the actions, prosecutors would later argue, of someone simply delivering ginger ale to a friend. Digital forensics would provide another crucial piece of the puzzle. Sandra's phone showed activity until 9:52 p.m. on February 1st, her last action being a search for early pregnancy symptoms. 3 minutes later, at 9:55 p.m., surveillance footage showed Farwell leaving her apartment. Her phone never registered activity again. Even more telling were Farwell's own digital footprints. In the hours before visiting Sandra, he had conducted multiple internet searches that prosecutors would later describe as incriminating. How to delete text messages permanently, undetectable suicide methods, and can police recover deleted messages? After leaving her apartment, he made similar searches for how long before body found after death and decomposition timeline apartment. Before her death, text messages between Farwell and Birchmore paint a picture of a troubled and controlling relationship. In one exchange, months before her death, Birchmore texted Farwell asking if he wanted her to just take what you do or try and say no. I know being told no is your favorite, to which he allegedly responded simply, say no. A week before her death, Sandra had texted a friend about Farwell acting suspiciously in her apartment. She described finding him going through her personal papers, claiming he was looking for a pen. When she questioned him, he allegedly became defensive and left abruptly. This incident, seemingly minor at the time, would take on new significance in light of what prosecutors believe happened days later. And on January 24th, just days before her death, Farwell had allegedly asked Birchmore for a key to her apartment, claiming he wanted to be able to check on her during her pregnancy. This request, coming just after the report to the police department about their relationship, struck investigators as particularly suspicious in retrospect. These pieces would eventually come together to form a disturbing mosaic suggesting premeditation rather than a spontaneous suicide. But it would take years for investigators to assemble this mosaic, years during which Farwell continued to serve as a police officer, years during which Sandra's death remained officially classified as a suicide. The investigation into Sandra Birchmore's death wouldn't end with the initial ruling of suicide. As more details emerged about her relationship with Matthew Farwell, authorities took a closer look at the circumstances surrounding her death. The turning point came in early 2023, when a journalist investigating police misconduct in Massachusetts began looking into rumors about inappropriate relationships within the Stoughton Police Department's Explorers program. This investigation led to interviews with former participants, including some who had known Sandra during her time in the program. What emerged was a troubling pattern of behavior that extended beyond Farwell to include allegations against other officers. These revelations prompted the Birchmore family's attorney to commission an independent review of Sandra's autopsy findings. A pathologist hired by Birchmore's family concluded earlier in 2024 that her death was not suicide but homicide caused by strangulation, directly contradicting the medical examiner's initial finding. The independent pathologist noted several inconsistencies with the suicide theory. The ligature marks on Sandra's neck didn't match the pattern typically seen in hanging deaths. There were subtle bruises on her wrists that could indicate restraint. And most significantly, the internal examination revealed evidence of petechial hemorrhaging, tiny blood spots in the eyes and face that are more consistent with manual strangulation than with hanging. This new evidence prompted federal authorities to take a closer look at the case. The involvement of FBI agents brought fresh eyes and specialized resources to the investigation. Forensic analysts re-examined the physical evidence, digital specialists recovered previously overlooked data from electronic devices, and behavioral analysts assessed the relationship patterns between Farwell and Birchmore. With the involvement of the FBI, a more thorough investigation began to piece together the events of that February night. Digital evidence, surveillance footage, and witness statements painted a picture very different from the suicide scenario initially accepted. One key piece of evidence came from Sandra's pregnancy itself. Medical examiners confirmed she had been approximately 12 weeks pregnant at the time of her death. DNA analysis of the fetal tissue, ordered as part of the federal investigation, provided strong evidence that Farwell was indeed the father, connecting him biologically to both Sandra and her unborn child in a way that he could not deny. This biological connection gave prosecutors a powerful motive. If Sandra had carried the pregnancy to term, the child would have been living proof of a relationship that began when she was underage, evidence that could not only end Farwell's career, but potentially lead to criminal charges of statutory rape. The pregnancy represented an existential threat to everything Farwell had built. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a pattern of concerning behavior in the weeks leading up to Sandra's death. Financial records showed Farwell had withdrawn $5,000 in cash from his savings account 2 days before her death, money that was never accounted for and that prosecutors suggest may have been intended as an unsuccessful attempt to convince Sandra to terminate the pregnancy or to leave town. Cell tower data placed Farwell's phone near Sandra's apartment multiple times in the week before her death, including late-night visits that didn't appear on the building's surveillance footage, suggesting he may have been watching her apartment from outside or accessing the building through an unmonitored entrance. Perhaps most damning was the recovery of deleted text messages between Farwell and a fellow officer sent in the hours after Sandra's death. In these messages, Farwell allegedly wrote, "It's handled. She won't be a problem anymore." When the other officer asked for clarification, Farwell responded simply, "Cleaner this way for everyone." By August 2024, more than 3 years after Sandra's death, federal prosecutors had built a case they believed proved that Matthew Farwell had killed her to prevent her from revealing their relationship, particularly the fact that it began when she was underage and that he was allegedly the father of her unborn child. The case they assembled painted a disturbing picture of planned murder disguised as suicide, a calculated act designed to silence a young woman who had become a liability. This was not, prosecutors argued, a crime of passion or a spontaneous act, but rather a premeditated killing intended to protect Farwell's career, reputation, and freedom. On August 28, 2024, a SWAT team arrived at Matthew Farwell's residence in northeastern Massachusetts before dawn. The operation was carefully planned. Federal agents had been monitoring his movements for weeks, establishing patterns and identifying the safest time to make the arrest. At 5:42 a.m., they moved in. The arrest itself was swift and without incident. Farwell, apparently shocked by the sudden appearance of federal agents, offered no resistance. Neighbors reported being awakened by the commotion, looking out their windows to see the former police officer being led away in handcuffs, still wearing pajama pants and a T-shirt. He was indicted by a grand jury on the charge of killing a witness or victim under federal law, a charge that carries a mandatory life sentence, with the death penalty also a possibility. Additional charges included obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and civil rights violations, a comprehensive indictment that reflected the gravity of the allegations against him. News of the arrest sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community in Massachusetts. The Stoughton Police Department, already under scrutiny for its handling of the Explorers program, faced renewed questions about oversight and accountability. 3 officers, including Farwell, had already been implicated in inappropriate relationships with program participants, raising serious concerns about systemic failures within the department. FBI Assistant Special Agent in charge, Stephen Kelleher, didn't mince words about the allegations, stating that Farwell's position as a police officer did not give him the right to sexually exploit a child and then murder her. The blunt assessment reflected the outrage felt by many in law enforcement, a sense that Farwell had not only violated his oath, but had tarnished the badge all officers wear. Acting U.S. Attorney Joshua Levy remarked that Farwell had almost succeeded in covering up the murder and noted the serious nature of the charges, including the possibility of the death penalty. His comments highlighted the challenges investigators had faced in uncovering the truth, challenges that had allowed Farwell to remain free for over 3 years after Sandra's death. The arrest drew national media attention, with major networks covering the story and highlighting the broader issues it raised about power, accountability, and the vulnerability of young people in programs meant to protect and guide them. Sandra's story, once confined to local news and whispered conversations, now became a national conversation about trust, authority, and justice. For those who had known Sandra, the arrest brought a complex mixture of emotions: relief that her case was being taken seriously, vindication for those who had questioned the suicide ruling, but also renewed grief as the details of her final moments became public. Friends described the surreal experience of seeing her name in headlines, of hearing newscasters discuss the details of her life and death. For the law enforcement community, the case represented a painful reckoning. The arrest of one of their own on such serious charges forced uncomfortable questions about screening, supervision, and the culture that had allowed Farwell's alleged behavior to continue unchecked for years. Matthew Farwell pleaded not guilty to the charges against him. Due to the severity of the allegations and the risk he posed to the community, he was ordered held without bail. His legal team requested to cancel his detention hearing, opting for a voluntary order of detention while they reviewed the case materials. The legal process moved forward deliberately. Prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office presented their evidence to the court, building a case around the recovered digital evidence, surveillance footage, DNA testing, and witness statements. The case was complex, involving years of alleged grooming and exploitation, culminating in what prosecutors described as a calculated murder. Farwell's defense team mounted several challenges. They questioned the reliability of the independent pathologist's findings, arguing that the original medical examiner's ruling of suicide should stand. They challenged the admissibility of some digital evidence, claiming improper search procedures. And they suggested that the relationship between Farwell and Birchmore had been consensual and had only begun when she was legally an adult, directly contradicting the prosecution's timeline. As the legal proceedings unfolded, more details emerged about the Stoughton Police Explorers program and the alleged culture of misconduct that had existed within it. Former participants came forward with their own stories, some describing inappropriate comments, others alleging boundary violations, and a few describing scenarios that echoed Sandra's experience. The picture that emerged was of a program with limited oversight, where certain officers had exploited their positions to forge inappropriate relationships with vulnerable young people. The Stoughton Police Department faced its own reckoning. An internal investigation resulted in the resignation of 2 additional officers and disciplinary actions against several others. The Explorers program was suspended indefinitely, and the department announced a comprehensive review of all youth-oriented initiatives. The chief, while not directly implicated in any misconduct, faced calls for resignation over the department's failure to identify and address the alleged abuse within its ranks. A status hearing took place in February 2025, with another scheduled for April 15, 2025, as both prosecution and defense prepared for what would likely be a high-profile trial. Legal experts predicted a lengthy process, with pretrial motions extending well into late 2025 and the actual trial potentially beginning in early 2026. As the case moved through the legal system, Sandra's story continued to resonate. Advocacy groups pointed to her experience as a tragic example of how predators can operate within trusted institutions. Law enforcement agencies across the country began reviewing their own youth programs, implementing additional safeguards and oversight mechanisms to prevent similar abuses from occurring. The allegations against Matthew Farwell don't exist in isolation. They connect to a larger pattern of concerns about abuse within police explorer programs across the nation. An investigation by the Marshall Project published earlier in 2024 detailed the history of sexual abuse and misconduct allegations within law enforcement explorer programs and found nearly 200 allegations of abuse and misconduct in police explorer programs across the country. These allegations ranged from inappropriate comments to sexual assault, creating a disturbing picture of vulnerability within programs designed to mentor and guide young people. The report highlighted several commonalities across these cases: limited oversight, inconsistent vetting of adult participants, inadequate training about appropriate boundaries, and insufficient reporting mechanisms for young people who experienced misconduct. Many of the programs operated with minimal supervision, creating environments where inappropriate relationships could develop and persist for years without detection. Farwell was reportedly one of 3 Stoughton officers who allegedly had inappropriate relationships with teenagers in the Explorers program, raising serious questions about oversight and accountability within these youth initiatives. The clustering of multiple alleged offenders within a single department suggested not just individual misconduct, but potentially a culture that enabled such behavior. This cultural element became a focus of both the criminal investigation and subsequent departmental reforms. Investigators looked beyond Farwell to examine how the department's structure, policies, and practices might have enabled his alleged behavior. They found troubling gaps in supervision, inconsistent application of policies regarding interactions with program participants, and an informal culture that sometimes blurred professional boundaries. The case has also drawn parallels to other high-profile investigations in Norfolk County, raising questions about the integrity of investigations by local authorities and whether initial findings in death investigations are always thoroughly pursued. Critics pointed to other cases where deaths initially ruled as suicides were later reclassified after more thorough investigation, suggesting a pattern of premature conclusions in complex cases. These broader implications extended the significance of Sandra Birchmore's case beyond the specific allegations against Matthew Farwell. Her story became emblematic of larger systemic issues, a catalyst for examining how institutions meant to protect young people sometimes fail in that fundamental responsibility. As we look at the Matthew Farwell case, we are confronted with troubling questions about power, trust, and accountability. How could a relationship allegedly beginning with a 12-year-old girl and her 24-year-old instructor continue for nearly a decade without intervention? What safeguards failed? What warning signs were missed? The tragedy of Sandra Birchmore's life and death forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the institutions we trust to protect our communities and especially our children. For Sandra, the Explorers program represented a path to belonging, to purpose, perhaps even to family. Instead, prosecutors allege it became the beginning of years of exploitation that ultimately led to her death and the death of her unborn child. The warning signs were there, visible in retrospect but overlooked in real time. Sandra's increasing isolation from peers during her teenage years, the special attention from an instructor more than a decade her senior, her reluctance to discuss certain aspects of her life, even with close friends. These subtle indicators, pieced together after her death, painted a picture of a young woman caught in a web of manipulation and control more than a decade her senior. Her reluctance to discuss certain aspects of her life, even with close friends. These subtle indicators, pieced together after her death, painted a picture of a young woman. Identifying warning signs is only meaningful if there are mechanisms to address them, if there are trusted adults watching for such indicators, if there are clear reporting channels for concerns, if there is a culture that prioritizes the safety of vulnerable participants over the reputation of the program or its leaders. In Sandra's case, these mechanisms appear to have been insufficient or entirely absent. The alleged failure wasn't just institutional. It extended to the community, friends who noticed changes in Sandra's behavior but didn't know how to address them, teachers who observed her academic struggles but attributed them to normal teenage challenges, adults who might have noticed the unusual attention from an older instructor but hesitated to voice concerns without concrete evidence. The collective silence created an environment where exploitation could allegedly continue for years unchecked. Before her life was cut short, Sandra Birchmore was a young woman with dreams and aspirations. She had joined the Explorers program at age 12, hoping perhaps to find her place in the world of law enforcement, a community she admired and trusted. By 23, she was expecting a child, believing she would be a mother. Whether she knew the dangerous position she was in, or whether she still trusted the man she had known for nearly half her life, we may never fully know. What we do know is that her story has become a powerful reminder of how vulnerable young people can be, and how devastating the consequences can be when those entrusted with their safety abuse that trust. As Matthew Farwell awaits trial, the legal system will determine his guilt or innocence. But regardless of the outcome, Sandra Birchmore's story has already shed light on a troubling pattern that extends far beyond one police department or one Explorer program. The case against Matthew Farwell represents a deeply troubling example of alleged abuse of power and predatory behavior. What began as a mentorship relationship in a program designed to guide young people interested in law enforcement allegedly evolved into years of exploitation and ultimately, prosecutors contend, murder. As we reflect on this case, we're left with the sobering reminder that positions of authority come with profound responsibility. Responsibility that, when abused, can destroy lives. Sandra Birchmore's story serves as a tragic warning about the vulnerabilities that exist even within institutions designed to protect us, and the devastating consequences when those sworn to uphold the law instead exploit their power for their own purposes. As legal proceedings continue against Matthew Farwell, the search for justice for Sandra Birchmore and her unborn child remains ongoing. Her story, though tragic, may ultimately serve to protect other vulnerable young people by exposing abuses that might otherwise remain hidden in the shadows. We began this story by talking about trust, how it forms the foundation of our most important institutions. Perhaps the most important lesson from Sandra Birchmore's story is that trust, once broken, leaves wounds that may never fully heal. And when that trust is broken by those with power and authority, the damage extends beyond individuals to shake our faith in the very systems designed to keep us safe. The legal proceedings against Matthew Farwell are ongoing, and the search for truth and accountability continues. As his case moves through the courts, we are reminded that justice, though sometimes delayed, remains an essential goal, not just for Sandra Birchmore, but for all victims of abuse and exploitation. In the quiet town of Canton, Massachusetts, an apartment once filled with a young woman's hopes for the future now stands as a silent reminder of a life cut short. And in courtrooms and police departments across America, difficult questions continue to be asked about how we protect the vulnerable and hold accountable those who would abuse their power. These questions, sparked by tragedy though they may be, are necessary if we hope to prevent similar stories from unfolding in the future. For now, we can only hope that the pursuit of justice for Sandra Birchmore brings some measure of peace to those who knew and loved her, and that her story serves as a catalyst for meaningful change. In the aftermath of this case, police departments nationwide have begun implementing stronger safeguards in youth programs, more rigorous screening for adult participants, clearer boundaries for interactions, better reporting mechanisms, and increased supervision. These changes come too late for Sandra, but may protect future generations of young people who, like her, look to law enforcement as role models and mentors. Perhaps the most fitting memorial for Sandra Birchmore is not just the pursuit of justice in her individual case, but the systemic reforms her story has inspired, changes that recognize the sacred responsibility of protecting those who look to us for guidance and support. In the end, Sandra's story reminds us that the most important aspect of any position of authority is not the power it confers, but the responsibility it demands, the responsibility to protect, to nurture, and to honor the trust placed in us by those who are most vulnerable. It is a lesson written in tragedy, but one that may yet prevent future heartbreak if we have the courage to heed it. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and click on the notification bell to stay updated on our true crime stories. In our next episode, we'll explore another case that challenges our understanding of trust and betrayal within our most sacred institutions.